not going to be destroyed.
Never. Rome was destroyed. Greece was destroyed. Persia was destroyed. Spain was destroyed. All great countries are destroyed. Why not yours? How much longer do you think your country will last? Forever.
You're a shameful opportunist. What you don't understand is that it's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees.
You had it backwards. It's better to live on your feet than to die on your knees.
I know you were raised in the Central Valley. You went to Stanford.
Fresno High School Boy of the Year, 1963.
Awesome. And then eventually you became active in like anti-war activities, got in some trouble with the law here. I guess, could you start by just telling us?
Give you the thumbnail sketch?
Yeah.
Well, for me, it started when I went in 1964 when I went to Mississippi as a civil rights worker. It was like the first time I had kind of stepped out of normal behavior, for want of a better expression. And then when I got back from Mississippi, the war had just begun to escalate. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution had passed that summer, and after the experience of Mississippi, which was a kind of eye-opener for everybody, that this, who hadn't seen the South, that this could be going on in the America that we had learned about in high school civics, was remarkable. And one of the effects of that was that you suddenly stopped taking it all for granted, that what you'd been taught about what the United States was and how it behaved was actually the truth. And that doubt immediately attached itself to the war. It was pretty clear to me early on in that process that this was not the war that I'd been raised to fight. I mean, my generation assumed they were going to be in a war. Americans were supposed to, be the guys in the white hats and be doing, fighting for all things good and true. And what we were doing was pretty clear, that just picking up the French Empire where it had dropped off. We were fighting a war to maintain a government that none of us would have accepted as dog catchers in our own communities. I made up my mind that this was not something that I was going to support. The real pressing issue for everybody in my generation was, what do you do about the draft, or military conscription? When you turned 18, you had to go down and register with the selective service system, which was the mechanism that they used for drafting people. When you did that, you were issued a card that proved that you had registered. Technically, you could be arrested and sent to prison for 5 years for not having your card on your possession at all times. So that's how the draft card became a focus of a lot of anti-war activity. And the potential of the draft was, of course, the centerpiece for every young man between the age of 18 and 26. So in 1966, I first, at the time I was Stanford student body president, I first refused to accept a student deferment, because that seemed to me that whatever you thought about the war, if Americans were going to have wars, then everybody should be fighting it, not just the poor people. I sent them a letter saying I'm not going to cooperate with this. They ordered me to report for a pre-induction physical, and then report for 2 years worth of military duty. And I refused, and I was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. And I eventually spent 20 months in prison before being paroled, and then continued to organize against the war till the peace agreements were finally signed. Since the government didn't have to ask anybody's permission to expand the war, I mean, once they were given quote, peacetime conscription, once they had that mechanism, which they had since 1947, all they had to do was just dial up the numbers on how many soldiers they were going to take. And so they would do so and just escalate and escalate. And as the war escalated, staying out of the war became a more difficult proposition. So that was a kind of constant pressure.
So then, with your time at Stanford, how did your role as student body president, if at all, affect what was going on around you? Like, were other people influencing you, influence over your own friends? How did that, if at all?
Whenever a bunch of young people got together at that time, there would be ongoing discussion. And the war, at least among my set of friends, was one that always came up. You didn't want to do nothing. I mean, to just sit on the sidelines and find your own way out. So the question was always, well, how do we respond to this war in a way that can stop it? And ultimately, that also became a personal question of, what are you going to do about the fact that they've got your name on a list and someday they may very well call your name? And how are you going to respond to that? And then the larger political question of, how does this war policy work? Well, it functions because everybody stands in line. They don't necessarily need Stanford students to fill out their draft quotas. They just need Stanford students and their like to cooperate with the system that drafts the poor people. The real question is, what do you do when you look up and find evil being perpetrated by your government, your society, your friends, your neighbors? I mean, perpetrating stuff that we tried Nazis for at the end of World War II. I mean, these are war crimes that are going on, and the question is, are you going to participate in that, even in the most passive kind of way? Or are you going to find your way to throw yourself on the body of the machine? Who are you? Are you the kind of person that stands back and lets people be burned alive in their huts? Or, are you the kind of person that tries to stop that?
So you obviously felt justified in your actions, but then you were tried and sent to prison. Like, how did that feel, knowing that it was simply for disobeying a government order?
Well, of course it was crazy, in the sense of, what can this really be happening? This is going to happen to me because I don't want to kill anybody for no good reason. So the absurdity of it was always apparent. The hard part was not confronting the government. The hard part was getting past your parents. And my father, who was no great fan of the war, begged me not to do what I was doing. You're going to ruin your life. Here you are at Stanford University, and you're going to throw all that away. My only answer was, well, it's my life, and I'm going to spend it the way I think it needs to be spent, and somebody has to stand up here. Being young in those days, you were on the forefront. When they were going to invade Iraq, you go to the marches. There's all kinds of old people, young people, everybody in between. In my day, you have an anti-war march, 90% of the people are under the age of 26. We were the ones who had to break out against the war. I found myself in a position of influence I hadn't anticipated. And that prompted me also to move forward with refusing the draft. Okay, here I am. I'm in a position where what I do is going to be visible and have influence on people. I'm going to use the opportunity.
So you and your friends, both at Stanford and not at Stanford, you were all called to these local draft boards to get your draft cards and do all these things. Did any of them decide to go to war? And if so, how did that affect you?
Well, I knew a couple of people who submitted to being drafted, and I certainly, people from high school. First off, it affected you with your friends, and how can you help them in that situation, or is there anything you can do in that situation? And one of them went AWOL, so we ended up hiding him from the military authorities. There was a constant sense that you and people like you had something happening to them that was happening all the time, and it separated you from most people who didn't have any stake in it. You know, I mean, they didn't even raise taxes on the great silent majority that you've joined here.
You are actually in my history textbook as some like primary source speaker on the Vietnam War. And Daniel Ellsberg was talking about you and you getting arrested. First of all, did you know him personally, or?
Well, I had a weird connection with, I didn't know him before any of this, he did what he did, but there was a weird connection, because when Dan was trying to figure out what to do with the Pentagon Papers, one of the people that he consulted with was a guy named Randy Keeler, who was somebody I knew who was a draft resistance organizer, and eventually was in one of the prisons that I was in at the same time I was. And at that time he was in this prison, which this Keeler would come back from visiting hours, you know, saying, God, there's this weird guy who works for the Rand Corporation who's got all these papers, who comes to, you know, and he's coming and talking to me about what he should do with this stuff. So we all knew about Ellsberg before he became this public figure, because he was talking with Keeler in the visiting yard. But I never met Dan until after I got out of prison.
Obviously, he chose to release the Pentagon Papers, and do you think that was a smart move?
I think it was great. You know, throughout the anti-war movement, we believed in information. We believed that the more you knew about the war, the more you were going to be against it. That the more people learned, the more people were going to side with us. And the ultimate case of that was the Pentagon Papers. The notion that the government had been lying to us about the war suddenly became a mainstream notion. And from that point on, you know, politicians were increasingly on the defensive about it.
With things that are going on today in like Afghanistan and Iraq, like what can we take from Vietnam? Like what have we learned, would you say, if anything, because we're still in all these places, because Americans usually consider, you know, justified in being in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Middle East, Syria, all of these places. Do you think we've learned anything?
Well, I think some of us have learned something. Obviously, the government hasn't learned a lot, and we went right back into the same pattern. I mean, Iraq is the classic example. You know, I think some of us have learned, but most of us obviously haven't, or, you know, choose not to remember. And as a consequence, here we are, going through the same cycle all over again.
It always seems like there was this something special that prompted people to take a side, take a stance. Do you have any idea what that is? And do you have any message for people in my generation?
Well, I think that factor in my generation was taking it personally. I mean, kind of stripping away the anonymity of society. Behind that anonymity were millions of individual decisions that were being made. Accepted the notion that if you believed something, then you had to act on it, or it wasn't a real belief. Accepted the notion that if you believed something, then you had to act on it, or it wasn't a real belief. You know, I'm certainly in no position to be a critique, to critique the current generation and say they're this, that, or the other thing. You know, I look at what's going on in the world and I wonder, where the hell are the young people? Not just with the wars, but hey, global warming. I mean, give me a break. This is me. The effect on me is going to be relatively marginal. I'm going to be dead before this stuff really starts to happen. But you guys, this is right in your wheelhouse. This is your future that's going to have to either be addressed or not. And so I see every reason there that I would think young people will be up in arms, and nobody is. And so, our attempt to get the society to take responsibilities for its actions ultimately failed because they sloughed it off. Oh, Vietnam was a mistake. And as a consequence, we didn't learn the lessons. And during that period, if you look at, it was the young people who were the ones that made all the change happen. It's really important to remember that in the 60s too, it started little. You gotta go through small to get to big. And in the beginning, if we could get 20 people to join a vigil on Stanford campus against the war, we thought we were doing really well. And so the image of the 60s of millions of people out in the streets, it didn't start that way. It started much smaller, and individual people's willingness to step out of the herd and do something different is what made options for everybody to be different ultimately. So it's important to remember it wasn't like it ended up. It took a long time to build that. Back in those days, I wanted to be able to be 67 years old and look back and feel good about what I did, and that worked.
Staring at the carnage, praying that the sun would never rise, living another day in disguise. These feelings